Hey everybody, it's Rob. We're going to look at the structure of the book of Revelation. And this might seem like a little technical or whatever. I'm going to try to keep it as simple and straightforward as possible, but I can't tell you how important this is. People go to the book of Revelation and they mine this verse, they mine that verse, and they fail to understand what's happening in light of the structure of the book of Revelation. Here's what I'm going to lay out. I think the book of Revelation begins with a prologue, chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. And I think video 1a, we looked at the inclusios, along with Revelation 22, 6 through 21, how the prologue and the epilogue, or the introduction and conclusion, have these parallel parts that kind of give you an idea, an indication of John's objective, his motives, his intents. Then we have four main scenes, and we're going to look at these briefly and why I think they're main scenes or stories. At least the first two are stories. The third and the fourth one are scenes. The first scene we started to look at in the last video was chapter 1, verses 3 through 22. This scene number 1, John's on Patmos. Then in chapter 4, verse 1 through 16:21, this is story number 2, and this is the main story in the book of Revelation. The seals, trumpets, and bowls, two witnesses, the beast, all that is contained in the second story. And I'm going to explain why I think the story begins in chapter 4, verse 1, why I think it ends in chapter 16, verse 21. The third scene, which is not really a story, the third scene now is in chapter 17, 1 through 19:10. And it's John's in the wilderness, and he sees a prostitute or a city, a woman who's a city, but she's the great prostitute or the great harlot. Then the fourth scene, so skip this middle one. I'm putting with my cursor, but I realize you guys can't see the cursor as I look at my screen. But let's skip that the fifth scene, what I call a bridge section. And that is, go to chapter 21, verse 9 through chapter 22, verse 9. And it's scene number 4. John's on a mountain, and he sees the bride or a holy city. Notice that scene 3 and scene 4 parallel one another. They even contrast one another. They're going to have almost identical openings and beginnings. Very similar. One's a bride, and it says city. The other's a harlot, and is a city. And so they're both women. They're both cities. One's a harlot. One's a bride. Now, in the middle of those two, we're going to have what I call in my commentary, a fifth bridge scene. Now, for those of you that really want to study this much more in detail, I want to encourage you, of course, to get my commentary, Revelation, a love story. I have an entire chapter on the structure of the book of Revelation. I lay out this outline and more detailed outlines. So I really want to encourage you to get that chapter and kind of go through that. But let's go look at the text and see why I think this is the way the book of Revelation flushes out. So we have chapter 1, verses 1 through 8 that we've already discussed. That's your prologue. All of a sudden now we have a scene, and John's scene is, I'm on the island of Patmos. And by the way, kind of the trivial question, where did John write the book of Revelation? People always say on the island of Patmos. He says he was on the island of Patmos. Doesn't matter. The point is, this first scene or this first story takes place on Patmos. And as I explained in the last video, there's a story because there's movement in the story. He's on Patmos. He hears a voice. He's told to write in a book to the 7 churches. He looks to see the voice. He sees the resurrected Jesus. He describes the resurrected Jesus, and then he writes the 7 messages to the 7 churches, beginning and in fact, at this point in time, when we get to chapter 3, verse 22, and he finishes the 7th message, we actually kind of figured out this should be like the end of the book. All of a sudden, a new scene. It's interesting that the New American Standard said a scene in heaven, but a new scene opens up where all of a sudden John says, after these things, I looked and behold, a door was standing open in heaven, and a voice says, come up here. And so John goes up and he's in a new location. If you notice on the previous slide, if you notice that what I have, each of these 4 scenes, they're all in a different location. John's on Patmos, then John's in heaven, then John's taken to a wilderness, then John's on a mountain. That's one of your first clues that we have a scene, a change of scene, a change of location. Actually, it's kind of similar to the way the Gospel of Luke is actually structured a little bit, where Luke will make a major transition, a major scene change. Jesus is in a different location on a different subject. There's your indication that we've changed the scene, and the Gospel and the book of Revelation is doing the same thing. Now, the second scene happens where John's in heaven, and he's in the Spirit, and he sees God sitting on a throne. Now, watch the story. This is why I call it story number 2. God's sitting on a throne. Chapter 5, he's got a book in his right hand. An angel says, who's worthy to open the book and break its seals? But no one, and John even begins to weep. There's a story. Things are happening. A movement's happening. And one of the elders says, don't weep. The lion has overcome. He can open the book. John looks to see the lion, and he sees a lamb that was slain. And he takes the book out of the Father's right hand. And all these living creatures and elders, they fall down before Jesus and say, you are worthy to take the book and to break its seals. Chapter 6, Jesus begins to break each of the 7 seals by which this book was closed. All of a sudden, we have a story, we have movement. In fact, if we skip for a second to chapter 10, all of a sudden we see Jesus has broken all 7 of the seals, and John sees an angel coming down, or a strong angel coming down, and strong angel is really important here. And in his hand, he had a little book which was open. Exactly what we expect to see. If the scroll that John has, or that Jesus has, he's broken each of the 7 seals, the next time we see it, it's open. And I'm going to argue at great length in my commentary, which I do, and I'll argue a little bit length in these video series, that this is the same scroll. John then takes the scroll, and angel says, go take the scroll from that angel. Goes to the angel, says, hey, give me the little book. And the angel said, take it and eat it. John eats it, and it was as sweet as honey in his mouth, but his stomach was bitter. And then he's told, you must prophesy again. And then he prophesies, and he prophesies the story of the 2 witnesses. In fact, I will argue that the story of the 2 witnesses is the center of this second story because it's the contents of the scroll. Now, there's chapters 12, 13, and 14, which is, I think, a parenthesis. We don't have to worry about the details here, but verse 19 here, the temple of God is in heaven, is open. You go to chapter 15, chapter 15, verse 5. I looked in the temple, the tabernacle of testimony in heaven was open. There's your framing again. I think 12 through 14 is kind of a parenthesis. Chapter 15 then introduces the last set of judgment, where the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets. I know I'm going quickly. And now we're going to have the 7 bowls. The 7 angels who have the 7 last plagues, and that 7 last plagues happens to be 7 bowls. The 7 angels who have the 7 last plagues came out of the temple, and the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels the 7 golden bowls for the wrath of God. Chapter 16, the 7 bowls. And there we go, the end of story number 2. All of a sudden, guess what happens? John is carried away in the spirit into a wilderness. Scene number 3. Now, this scene's not a story so much, not as much like progress. This happens, and this happens, and this happens. There's a little bit of it, but instead, John sees a woman. Come, I'll show you the judgment of the great prostitute, the great harlot, who sits on many waters. He sees this woman, but she's actually described as a great city. In fact, the woman whom you saw is the great city. And then chapter 18, it's the judgment of this woman. And then it ends, I think it ends, in chapter 19, verses 9 and 10. He said to me, right, blessed are those who invited the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said, these are the true words of God. John says, I fell at his feet to worship him. But he said to me, do not do that. I'm a fellow servant of yours and of your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus, worship God. For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. I'm going to suggest Richard Balcom is the one who really argued this. And what I'm presenting here actually is building off the work of Richard Balcom. I've added to it a little bit more. I think I found a few more nuances and fine-tuned his argument. But the whole idea of the 4 major scenes really comes from Richard Balcom predominantly. But this is the end of the 3rd scene. Now, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, how do we know that this is the 4th scene? Well, look, John's carried away in the spirit to a great and high mountain, another location. And he says, look, I'm going to show you the holy city. Wait a minute. He was told, I'm going to show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. Instead, he showed the city. So we see the 3rd scene and the 4th scene are descriptions of women that are cities. One's the bride and one's the great prostitute. Now, notice the end of this particular scene. Chapter 22, verses 6 through 9, it says, I, John, verse 8, I'm the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed me these things. He said, don't do that. I'm a fellow servant of yours and of your brothers, the prophets, and those who heed the words of this book worship God. So both the scene of the great prostitute and now the scene of the bride, they both end with John falling down at the feet of an angel to worship and being told, don't do it. There's a clear indication that that's the end of the scene and this is the end of the scene. That means we have a 5th scene in the middle. And this 5th scene, I'm actually calling my commentary a bridge scene. And in this scene, it's going to be, and I saw, then I saw, and I saw. And I saw is not a major structural indicator, but it's an indicator of structure within a unit. That's a little bit complex, but people have made and I saw a massive indication of structure in the book of Revelation. And that's just not correct. We can't find structure like major structure with and I saw, which is kai edon over here in the Greek. Instead, what happens is Jesus is described as coming down from heaven. So let me put it this way. We have the judgment of the great prostitute. And then we're going to have the introduction to the bride. The prostitute gives way. The bride enters the story. But before the bride enters the story, Jesus must return. The descent of Christ to the earth. Jesus returns, and then what does he do? Well, he judges his enemies. The first enemy is the false prophet, the beast and the false prophet, the two beasts of Revelation 13. Then he judges Satan. And notice the beast and the false prophet are thrown alive in the lake of fire. Notice the judgment of Satan. He's going to be thrown into the lake of fire. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire. Then there's going to be a judgment of death and Hades. And death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. So I know I went over that really quickly. We'll go over it in a little bit more detail when we look at these videos. And this is all in my commentary. But here's what you have. This bridge scene, Jesus descends. The enemies of God or enemies of Christ are judged. The beast and the false prophet, the two beasts of Revelation 13, thrown in the lake of fire. The dragon or the devil, thrown in the lake of fire. Death and Hades, thrown in the lake of fire. Then we have an introduction to the New Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth. This is an introduction. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down. And here's what we know about it. It's the tabernacle of God's among men. He's going to wipe away every tear from their eyes. God's going to be with them, and there'll be no more death. I'm making all things through. And he says, it is true. This is the good news. But we know that verse 9 and 10 begin the beginning of this fourth story, because look at the beginning of chapter 21, verse 9, the beginning of this fourth story. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls for the seven last plagues came and spoke with me, saying, okay, now let's go to chapter 17, verse 1. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, come here, and I will show you. 21, verse 9. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls for the seven last plagues came and spoke with me, saying, come here, and I will show you. The introduction to the third scene and the fourth scene are almost absolutely verbatim. The difference is he's going to be shown the wife of the Lamb, whereas in chapter 17, he's going to be shown the judgment. In chapter 17, he's going to be shown the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. So the fact that we have these four major scenes with a fifth bridge section then is really well substantiated. First off, each of the scenes or stories, the first two are stories, takes place in a different location, a change of location. In fact, the second, third, and fourth scene, John says he was carried away in the Spirit. Whereas in the first scene, John was in the Spirit, but not carried away in the Spirit. Of course, that's because he's already there. In the first scene, John's not taken anywhere because he's already there. But the second, third, and fourth scene, he's taken somewhere. So he's in the Spirit, he's carried away, he hears a voice say, come. The second, third, and fourth scene, each have a voice say, come. Now, when I came to this conclusion and realized not only is Richard Bauckham correct, but the fifth bridge scene, I don't think he defined it as well as I have defined it. Maybe he did, but no, I thought, okay, this actually makes sense. And this is a quick anecdote. For years, I've been studying the book of Revelation. And early on in my studies, 25 or more years ago, you read all these commentaries and scholarly articles, and they're everywhere. And it seems like everybody has their own idea of how the structure of the book of Revelation lays out. There's 12 sections or 12 scenes. There's 7 of this or 7 of that. And it all seems kind of arbitrary, to be honest with you. Nobody has any real concrete proof as to why this is the way it should be or why that's the way it should be. And I was simply not convinced, even as a graduate student and a postgraduate student. I wasn't convinced that any of them were actually correct. When I began to see what Richard Bauckham was saying, look, he's in a location, taken to another location in the Spirit. Here's a voice say, come. It's really pretty clear. I thought, oh, great. And then I thought, oh, the good news is I don't have to worry about the 7 structures or 7 of this or 7 of that. And then I thought, oh, there are 7 sections to the book of Revelation. There's an introduction or a prologue. There's an epilogue or a conclusion. There's 4 main scenes and a 5th bridge scene. That makes 7. And to be honest with you, I was almost disappointed. I was like, oh, darn it. I just became one of them. I became what everybody else is trying to do. And I thought, no, actually, if this really is the way the book of Revelation is structured and is laid out, then we should expect it to have 7 or 10 or 12. It shouldn't be surprising. In fact, if it was 6 or 8, we might want to go, are we even correct? So I think without question, this is how we structure the book of Revelation. Now, this leads us to go, okay, why does this matter? What's so significant about this? And what I think is so significant about this is that we have to understand the story, especially in this middle part, chapter 4 through chapter 16, of what's going on. The story is going to be this. In chapter 4, God's throne's in heaven. In 21 and 22, the throne of God comes down to the earth. Heaven and earth are reunited. And I think one of the major questions that you see in the story of the book of Revelation is what's needed for the throne of God to come from heaven to the earth. And I think the answer is The nations have to be redeemed. It's God's love for the nations as to why he's delaying. So in Revelation chapter 6, the souls under the altar are going to go, "How long, O Lord? How long?" And they're going to be told, "Not yet." And the answer, as we'll see as we go through the story, is not yet, because twofold. My people have not suffered. My people have not died. They have not laid down their lives for the gospel. Just like Jesus was crucified for us, laid down his life for us, so also we lay down our lives for the nations. And the second thing is, and the nations have been redeemed. And those two things go together. The nations are redeemed when God's people lay down their lives for the nations, just like Jesus, the slain lamb, laid down his life for us. Revelation is a love story, and God's people are a key fundamental part of that story.